Welcome back to Fusty Stories. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and get ready for another story you won't forget. Let's dive back to the story. Florence Leonard often sat by her bedroom window at night, staring into the city lights with silent prayers clinging to her lips. She was 5 months pregnant, but instead of the warmth of her husband's love, she felt a constant chill of neglect. Vincent Morgan, the man she had married, was everything to society. A successful businessman, a charming figure, the man every other woman seemed to desire. But to Florence, he was a stranger under the same roof. Their conversations had dwindled to cold exchanges, and when he did speak, it was often laced with mockery or subtle disdain. She told herself it was the stress of his work, but deep down, she knew it was more. Vincent didn't love her, he tolerated her. Yet Florence clung to the fragile hope that their child might awaken a softer side in him. Vincent, however, lived another life entirely, one that Florence never saw fully but often felt in whispers. Behind her back, he spent nights with Clara James, his mistress, a woman who basked in the wealth and attention that should have been his wife's. Clara fed his ego, showered him with flattery, and in return, Vincent spoiled her with gifts, luxury trips, and the very affection Florence begged for in silence. To Vincent, marriage to Florence was a burden, a mistake chained by duty rather than love. Every time he looked at her rounded belly, he didn't see a blessing, he saw shackles tying him down. Yet Florence, with her tender heart, tried to believe in him still, unaware of the storm he was planning that would tear her world apart. Clara James knew her place in Vincent's life, and she relished it. To her, Florence was nothing but an obstacle, a dull shadow who had trapped Vincent in a marriage that never should have happened. Clara's beauty was dazzling, her voice always dripping with seductive confidence, and her laughter could melt Vincent's hardened heart in ways Florence never managed. It wasn't enough to share Vincent's wealth and body. Clara wanted more. She wanted to take Florence's place completely, to humiliate her publicly until she became invisible. To achieve this, she began whispering poisonous words into Vincent's ears, fueling his contempt toward his wife, stoking the fire of cruelty in him. Every luxury Clara wore was a reminder of how much Florence had lost, and every moment Vincent spent with her mistress only deepened his scorn for his wife. Vincent himself didn't need much convincing. He had grown accustomed to Clara's intoxicating presence and began to despise Florence even more openly. While Florence carefully arranged their home, trying to keep their marriage afloat, Vincent mocked her behind closed doors with Clara. He spoke about her plainness, her pitiful devotion, and worst of all, her pregnancy, which he claimed made her less appealing and more of a burden. Clara fed off these words, and together they devised a plan to break Florence completely. Vincent promised Clara something dramatic, something unforgettable, an act that would shame Florence beyond repair. Clara's eyes sparkled with wicked delight. "Do it on your anniversary," she whispered, her red lips curling into a sinister smile. And Vincent, intoxicated by her venom, agreed. Florence had always cherished anniversaries, believing they were sacred milestones that reminded couples of their journey together. So when Vincent casually reminded her of their upcoming 5th wedding anniversary, her heart lit up like a candle in the dark. She couldn't believe he remembered. For weeks, she had been afraid he might let the day slip by, lost in business deals and other distractions. His sudden interest filled her with hope. Perhaps this time, things were changing. Perhaps he was finally noticing her, seeing her not just as his wife, but as a woman worthy of love. She spent days preparing herself, buying a simple, elegant gown with money she had secretly saved, eager to surprise him with her radiant presence. Meanwhile, Vincent orchestrated every detail with Clara, who gloated as she watched Florence make preparations in vain. He booked the grand ballroom of one of the most luxurious hotels in the city, inviting friends, colleagues, and family. To Florence, this was a miracle. To Vincent, it was the perfect stage. Clara sat in the shadows, watching Florence unknowingly walk into the trap they had laid. Florence even practiced her speech of gratitude, rehearsing lines of appreciation for Vincent's love. Her heart swelled with fragile joy, but Vincent's heart was already hardened with cruel intentions. The night was set to become the turning point of her life, a night she would never forget, not because of the love she expected, but because of the humiliation she never saw coming. The grand ballroom shimmered with golden chandeliers, the tables adorned with roses and crystal glasses. Guests laughed, toasted, and admired the seemingly perfect couple. Florence, dressed in her flowing gown, glowed with the quiet elegance of a woman carrying new life. Her hand often rested gently on her belly, and her smile never left her lips. She whispered to her unborn child, "Tonight your father will see us, truly see us." Every guest who greeted her that evening echoed her belief, congratulating the couple, praising Vincent's thoughtfulness in organizing such a beautiful evening. To Florence, it felt like the beginning of a new chapter. Vincent, however, watched her with eyes filled not with love, but with calculation. Clara sat in the crowd, pretending to be just another guest, though the fire of anticipation burned in her chest. She was eager to see Florence crumble. When Vincent rose to speak, the room fell into silence. His voice started soft and tender, speaking about love, devotion, and the sacrifices Florence had made. Florence's heart swelled with pride, tears glistening in her eyes. For the first time in years, she felt visible. But as Vincent's speech went on, the tenderness dissolved into venom. He sneered at her flaws, mocked her body, and belittled her pregnancy. Before the stunned guests, he raised his glass, then poured the drink over Florence's head, soaking her hair and dress. Gasps echoed through the room, and laughter erupted from Clara's corner. Florence sat frozen, her dignity shattered in front of everyone she thought cared. The champagne trickled down her face, sticky and cold, but it was nothing compared to the burn in Florence's chest. Her entire body trembled as humiliation crashed over her like a tidal wave. She wanted to vanish, to be swallowed by the marble floor beneath her. Guests shifted uncomfortably, some looking away, others whispering in disbelief. A few even smirked, entertained by the spectacle. Vincent's face was twisted with cruelty. His lips curled as he mocked not only Florence, but also the child she carried. "Even the thing inside you won't make me love you," he spat. Each word was a dagger, ripping through the fragile hope she had nurtured for years. Florence pushed back her chair, her tears hidden behind the mask of silent strength. She refused to let him see her break completely. Without another word, she walked out of the ballroom, her head held high, though her spirit was in pieces. Outside, the night air hit her face, cooling her wet hair, and she realized the truth she had avoided for too long. There was nothing left to salvage. The man she had married was gone, or perhaps he was never there at all. That night, Florence swore to herself she would never forgive Vincent. Whatever it cost her, she would break free from the chains of his cruelty, even if it meant walking into the unknown with nothing but the child in her womb. The following morning, Florence sat in the quiet of their home, her suitcase lying half-packed at her feet. She replayed the anniversary scene in her mind over and over, each memory cutting deeper. Vincent had humiliated her not just as a wife, but as a woman, as a mother. Her unborn child had been mocked before taking its first breath, and that was the final wound she could not endure. She picked up her pen and began drafting the divorce papers, her tears smudging the ink, but her resolve unshaken. For years, she had prayed for love from Vincent. Now, she prayed only for freedom. When Vincent saw the papers, he laughed, a cruel, mocking laugh that echoed through the room. "Finally," he sneered, "I thought you'd cling on forever like a parasite. Good riddance, Florence." His words were venom, but instead of weakening her, they strengthened her resolve. He paraded his mistress openly now, flaunting Clara as if to remind Florence of her defeat. But Florence didn't look back. Signing the papers felt like cutting chains off her wrists. She left the mansion without wealth, without status, without security. Yet for the first time in years, she carried something Vincent could never touch, her dignity. Florence's new life began in a cramped one-room apartment in a quiet part of the city. The paint on the walls peeled, the plumbing groaned, and the mattress was barely soft enough to sleep on. But it was hers. Free from Vincent's insults, Florence found peace even in the midst of poverty. But reality struck harder than she imagined. With her pregnancy showing, every job interview turned into rejection. Employers frowned at her belly, whispering excuses about not fit for the role or too much risk. Each rejection letter felt like another door slammed shut, another reminder that society saw her as broken, unworthy, incapable. Yet Florence refused to give up. Each morning she rose early, dressed in her cleanest clothes, and knocked on doors. She carried her child not as a burden, but as a promise to fight harder. At night, she whispered lullabies to her unborn baby, telling them they would survive together, no matter how cruel the world became. Hunger clawed at her sometimes, loneliness sat heavy in her chest, but she pushed forward. Then one evening, after countless rejections, she stumbled upon a local bar that needed help. They didn't care about her pregnancy, they cared about her determination. Florence took the job as a waitress, not knowing that stepping to that bar would change the course of her life forever. The bar was noisy, filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and the smell of fried food. Florence worked tirelessly, balancing trays, enduring rude customers, and ignoring the sharp pain in her back that pregnancy often brought. Still, she wore a small smile, determined to make it through the night. On one of those evenings, a man entered the bar who immediately drew every eye in the room. Ethan Williams, one of the city's most powerful billionaires, was known for his wealth, influence, and untouchable aura. Yet he walked in alone, without his usual entourage, and chose a quiet corner table. Florence approached him nervously, pen and pad in hand, her simple uniform clinging to her weary frame. Ethan looked up, and for a moment his eyes softened at the sight of her. Unlike the others, he didn't glance at her belly with judgment. He looked into her eyes with curiosity and warmth. "You shouldn't be working like this," he said gently after ordering a drink. His words startled Florence. No one had shown such concern in months. She brushed it off, insisting she was fine, but Ethan watched her with growing intrigue. Something about her spirit, her quiet dignity, despite her weariness, captured his heart instantly. Ethan began visiting the bar frequently, always choosing Florence's section, always asking about her day. At first she thought it was pity, but soon she realized he was genuinely interested in her life. He listened as she spoke about her struggles, about losing her marriage, and about how no one wanted to employ a pregnant woman. She never mentioned Vincent's name, only that her past was painful, and Ethan never pressed further. Instead, he admired her resilience, her ability to smile despite the weight on her shoulders. One night, Florence finally confessed the truth of her situation, how her husband had humiliated her, how he mocked her child, and how she had been cast aside like dirt. Ethan's jaw clenched with silent fury, but his voice was tender as he said, "You deserve better, Florence, much better." He offered her something she had not felt in years, safety. He urged her to quit the bar, promising to care for her and her unborn child. Florence hesitated, unsure if she could trust another man again, but something in Ethan's sincerity began melting the walls she had built around her heart. Florence eventually agreed to leave the bar. Ethan made arrangements for her to move into a safer, more comfortable apartment. It wasn't the mansion she had left behind, but it was filled with peace, care, and most importantly, respect. He often visited, bringing meals, books, and soft laughter that filled the silence Florence had grown used to. Slowly, she began to feel alive again. The child in her womb no longer symbolized chains, but became the reason she embraced hope for tomorrow. For the first time in a long time, Florence began to dream, not of Vincent's love, but of a future free from him. She cherished Ethan's kindness, though she still hesitated to let her heart fully trust. Yet Ethan never pushed. He simply stayed, proving through his actions that he wasn't like Vincent. Meanwhile, across town, Vincent's world was beginning to crumble. His illegal dealings, carefully hidden behind the mask of a successful businessman, were catching up with him. Soon, Florence's decision to leave him would not only be her salvation, it would become the very thing that spared her from being dragged into the ruins of Vincent Morgan's downfall. Vincent Morgan's life, once gilded in luxury, began to crack like fragile glass. Business associates whispered about inconsistencies in his accounts, shipments that never reached their destinations, and transactions that smelled of corruption. What Florence never knew was that beneath his carefully polished public image, Vincent had long been smuggling drugs under the guise of import and export. It was this illegal empire that funded Clara's expensive jewelry and his ostentatious lifestyle. For years, he evaded suspicion, bribing the right officials, silencing the right mouths. But the higher he climbed, the more eyes turned toward him, and now the walls of deception were closing in. Clara, once intoxicated by Vincent's charm, began to see the shadows looming over him. She noticed his increasing paranoia, the way he snapped at her when things didn't go his way, and the silent fear that crept into his late-night phone calls. Clara was no fool. She had built her life on survival, not loyalty. To her, Vincent's fall was inevitable, and she refused to be dragged down with him. While Vincent schemed about how to protect his crumbling empire, Clara secretly started planning her exit, ready to abandon the man she once claimed to love the moment things turned ugly. The knock on Vincent's door one night was not the sound of a friend. It was the police. They stormed his mansion with warrants, seizing documents, computers, and drugs hidden in shipments he thought were untouchable. His arrest made headlines the next morning, splashed across every newspaper and broadcast, shocking the city. Business mogul Vincent Morgan arrested in drug scandal became the phrase on every lip. Florence read the news in disbelief. Despite the cruelty he had shown her, she had never imagined the man she once married was capable of such darkness. Clara, however, was nowhere to be found. The moment Vincent was taken into custody, she cut all ties. She vanished from the public eye, deleting photos, changing addresses, and distancing herself as if she had never known him. To Clara, Vincent was no longer useful. He was poison. Alone in his cold cell, Vincent realized the bitter truth. The woman he threw his wife away for, the one he had chosen over his unborn child, had abandoned him at his lowest. It was then that regret seeped into his bones, though it was too late. The empire he built on deceit had collapsed, and the one person who had once truly loved him, Florence, was gone. While Vincent rotted in a cell, Florence's life began to bloom under Ethan Williams's watchful care. Ethan was unlike any man she had ever known, patient, kind, and protective without being overbearing. He accompanied her to prenatal appointments, carried groceries into her apartment, and often sat beside her reading while she rested. He treated her not as a burden, but as a woman of worth, and slowly Florence's heart softened toward him. She realized that Ethan didn't see her pregnancy as a flaw, he saw it as proof of her strength. One evening, as they shared dinner in her small apartment, Ethan gently placed his hand near her belly, asking permission. When the baby kicked, his face lit up with genuine joy, as though he were already part of their little family. Florence felt her eyes water at the sight. For the first time in years, she felt cherished. It wasn't a grand gesture or expensive gift that won her over, but the simple, consistent acts of kindness that Ethan poured into her life. With every passing day, Florence began to envision a future that was no longer clouded by pain, but one illuminated by hope. Months passed and the day finally came. Florence went into labor on a stormy evening, the winds howling against the hospital windows. Fear and pain coursed through her body, but Ethan was by her side, holding her hand, whispering encouragement. Every scream, every tear, he endured with her, never letting go even when her grip nearly crushed his fingers. Hours later, the cries of a newborn filled the room, a baby girl with wide eyes and tiny fists that seemed to grasp onto life itself. Florence wept as the nurse placed the baby in her arms, overwhelmed by the miracle she now held. Ethan leaned close, his voice trembling with emotion. "She's perfect, Florence, just like her mother." The words struck deep into her heart, not because they flattered her, but because they came from a place of sincerity she had never known. Florence named the baby Amelia, a name that meant industrious and strong, qualities she hoped her daughter would embody. In that moment, Florence felt a rebirth of her own. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was living, and for the first time in a long time, she felt that perhaps love had finally found her again. After months of legal battles, bribes, and manipulations, Vincent Morgan was granted bail. The once proud mogul emerged from the courthouse not to applause, but to glares, whispers, and flashing cameras that recorded his shame. His wealth had dwindled, his reputation shattered, and his so-called friends abandoned him. He walked through the city streets, no longer a man admired, but one despised. His first thought was Clara, but when he reached out, he discovered she had left the country, running off with another wealthy man. Vincent, had been replaced as easily as one changes clothes. With bitterness twisting his heart, Vincent turned to the only person who had once stood by him, Florence. He convinced himself that if he apologized, if he begged for forgiveness, she would take him back. After all, she had once loved him fiercely. But what Vincent failed to realize was that Florence had grown stronger in his absence. She no longer needed him. In fact, she had built a new life, one where he had no place. Yet, blinded by arrogance, Vincent marched toward her door, determined to reclaim what he thought was his. Florence was rocking Amelia to sleep when the knock came. She opened the door, and there stood Vincent, his once arrogant posture replaced by desperation. His clothes were wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, and his voice cracked as he whispered her name. For a brief moment, old memories flooded Florence's mind, the nights she cried for his affection, the humiliation she endured, the coldness that nearly broke her spirit. And then, like a wave, anger swept those memories away. This man had poured a drink over her on their anniversary. He had mocked their child. He had left her to rot while he lived lavishly with Clara. And now he stood before her begging for mercy. "Florence, please," Vincent said, his voice trembling. "I made mistakes. I see that now. Give me another chance. Let me be part of Amelia's life." Florence's grip on the door tightened, her voice steady as steel. "You forfeited that right the moment you mocked her before she was even born." Her words cut deeper than any prison sentence. Vincent saw it in her eyes. The love she once had for him was gone. All that remained was disdain. He had lost her forever. Ethan arrived minutes later, sensing the tension in Florence's voice when she called him. When he stepped into the room and saw Vincent, his protective instincts surged. Vincent tried to assert himself, sneering. "So this is the man replacing me." Ethan didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he calmly placed himself between Florence and Vincent, his presence alone a shield. "She doesn't need you anymore," Ethan said firmly. "Leave, before I make sure you regret coming here." Vincent's pride stung, but even he could see the truth. Ethan's calm authority and the unwavering love in Florence's eyes when she looked at him were proof that Vincent had been replaced long before he arrived at her door. Unable to bear the reality, Vincent stormed out, vowing to return, though deep down he knew he no longer had the power. Ethan turned to Florence, brushing a tear from her cheek. "He won't hurt you again," he promised. Florence leaned into his embrace, realizing that Ethan wasn't just a man she could trust, he was the man she had always prayed for. In the months that followed, Ethan and Florence's bond only deepened. He introduced her to his world, not with arrogance, but with the intention of making her and Amelia feel safe and cherished. He invited her to charity events, introduced her to influential people, and always made sure she had the choice to say yes or no. Florence, once invisible in Vincent's shadow, now found herself respected and admired. More importantly, she had the freedom to speak, to shine, and to be herself without fear of judgment. Ethan adored Amelia as if she were his own. He changed diapers, rocked her to sleep, and delighted in every tiny milestone. To him, Florence and Amelia weren't burdens, they were blessings. Slowly, Florence allowed herself to dream of love again, of a life where she wasn't just surviving but thriving. Every time she looked into Ethan's eyes, she saw not just a man, but a partner, someone who would walk beside her no matter what storms came their way. Meanwhile, Vincent's life spiraled into ruin. Without Clara, without wealth, and without Florence, he had nothing. The business world shut its doors on him, and former allies turned their backs. He wandered the city, haunted by memories of what he had lost. Each time he saw Florence's name in the news, attending charity events beside Ethan, glowing with happiness, the weight of his failure crushed him further. He realized too late that in trying to destroy her, he had only destroyed himself. One night, as he sat in a dingy motel room, staring at the cracked ceiling, Vincent finally accepted the truth. Florence was gone. He had mocked her, abandoned her, and betrayed her, and in return, life had stripped him of everything. He was alone, forgotten, and broken, a shadow of the man he once was. The world moved on without him, and Florence thrived without his presence. It was the ultimate punishment, and one he would carry for the rest of his days. Years later, Florence stood in the garden of her new home, watching Amelia play among the flowers. The child's laughter filled the air, mingling with the warm rays of the sun. Ethan walked up behind her, wrapping his arms gently around her waist, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked softly, his voice tinged with the memory of her past pain. Florence turned to him, her eyes shining with peace. "No," she whispered. "What was meant to break me only made me stronger. Because of that pain, I found you." Together, they walked hand in hand, watching Amelia chase butterflies. Florence no longer carried the scars of her past as wounds. They were reminders of her resilience. She had risen from humiliation, betrayal, and despair, and found love in the most unexpected place. Ethan had given her not just a new life, but a new beginning. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Florence knew her story was not one of tragedy, but of triumph. She was no longer the broken woman Vincent once mocked. She was a queen in her own right, cherished, respected, and finally deeply loved. That's all for today. Like, subscribe, and see you in the next episode. Stay tuned.